Good morning. My name is Elena Simone Tyler, and I am Associate Pastor for Justice and Mission here at Westminster Presbyterian Church. I work closely with Westminster's Social Justice Ministry team. This 2020-21 program year, we're building the social justice forums around a common theme: wade in the water, becoming anti-racist. Every forum we hold this year is meant to encourage all of us to listen intently to voices beyond those of white privilege and to reflect on how we as a community of faith can help change a racialized system. Today, we welcome the Reverend Ana Kendig Flores and two panelists that she will introduce to join her in a discussion of U.S. Latine community in 2020. Ana is a board certified chaplain and is the immediate past moderator of the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area. Later this month, Ana will join the staff of the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area as its new and its first coordinator for the institutional assessment of race and equity, and also to support the ongoing anti-racism spiritual pilgrimage. The Latine community in 2020 is experiencing a moment of being at the center of several conversations. The crisis on the border is ongoing, while the COVID crisis has also highlighted the essential work of many Latine people in industries that are putting them at higher risk for contracting COVID. And the recent election highlighted the ways the Latine voting base is being courted by both political parties. And Latine people are connecting and supporting the movement for Black lives and having important conversations about race within the Latinx context. Please join me in welcoming Ana. Ana, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elena. And I'm so glad to be introducing two wonderful colleagues and prophetic voices in the church who have agreed to join me in this conversation. Kim Kryemes Park, who is the Director of Children and Families Ministries at Grace Covenant Presbyterian Church in Asheville, North Carolina. And Kim also serves on the board of More Light Presbyterians and served as a founding collaborator of the Presbyterian Youth Workers Association. And also we're joined by the Reverend Dr. Amaury Tañón-Santos, who is the Synod Networker for the Synod of the Northeast. And before his ministry in the Synod, Amaury was the pastor of congregations in Westchester County, New York, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and served as director of programs for continuing education at Princeton Theological Seminary. Amaury also served as a parish associate of Nuevas Fronteras Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth Presbytery. So all of us come with various skills and capacities and experiences in different parts of the PCUSA in this country, and our experience of being Latine, Latinx, Latinx, Latino, Latina, all of those words that you may have heard in relation to this community. And we'll talk a little bit about words together and as we get started. So maybe that's the way to get started. Kim or Amaury, if you want to start by talking a little bit about how you talk about yourself when it comes to words like culture, race, or ethnicity. And all three of those things mean something slightly different. So if you want to parse it, however you want to parse it, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to go because Amaury muted himself, so I'll take this opportunity while I have it. So thank you all for the invitation and to be in this conversation with you all. I always think of myself as an odd bird, which I think probably most Latinx folks feel in the Presbyterian Church as a whole. But I come from a family that is a third generation Hispanic from Utah, said no one ever in the Presbyterian Church. My grandfather actually was a part of the very first graduating class of Manal School, which is one of the Presbyterian boarding schools in New Mexico. He credited the church with his education and felt very strongly about that. So we were going to be Presbyterians. So as he and my grandmother grew their family of 10 children, then they continue to be Presbyterian. So I have this identity of someone whose family on their mom's side comes from New Mexico, where the border crossed them. And they have folks who are from a Spanish Basque background and then a Native Apache background. So we've got that mix going on in my mom's family. And then my father came from the Dominican Republic. And the Dominican Republic is quite interesting because you have a Haitian influence as well. And he was adopted. So I have this Dominicana thing going on, but also I have a Greek last maiden name, which makes no sense to anybody, but it's because my father was adopted by Greeks. So I also hold that as part of a cultural heritage that I am also a part of. I also believe that I carry a culture of Mormonism because I grew up in a predominantly Mormon area in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so the lens with which I see the world has a lot to do with the Mormon belief system and culture that came along with that. And then now I come into a family where I have married someone who identifies as white, and we have 2 children, one who presents very white and one who presents very Hispanic. And so we come at it in a bunch of different ways. So I think that's just to say, I don't have one identity. And so it makes it a little difficult, as I'm sure we will get into, to say I'm one thing or another. I'm all of those things simultaneously. And at times I feel more myself in certain areas than I do in others. So that's what I'll say right now.
And I can't top that. So this is this is what I'm going to say. My first encounter with having to self-identify and how I would describe myself happened in college. I was born, raised, studied in an island. I'm Puerto Rican of first generation. I migrated to the U.S. to do graduate studies almost 20 years ago, and I keep telling people that I'm going back home. So part of my identity is figuring out where home is, right? And 20 years is a lot of time to be not in your home country and still thinking that you're gonna go back home. So that's part of it. The other thing that I want to mention about being born in Puerto Rico is that I come from an island culture, and I say that because islands are literally isolated, right? Again, it didn't take me. I didn't have to think of how I identify myself until I went to college and I was presented with a question: how do you identify yourself, either as Hispanic American or Latin American, right? And there was this whole conversation, right, around culture and history and language that happened. And I landed and still land when I am asked this question that I am a Puerto Rican of Antillean and Latin American background, right? And I use those 2 larger connections because I think and believe that the Latin Americanness of Puerto Rico is a part of is not simply about the Spanish conquest and the language that we inherited out of that context, but it was about this European project in the Americas, that includes not only Spanish-speaking folk, not even only Portuguese-speaking folk at the think of Brazil, but also the whole breadth of the hemisphere. But I also embrace this Antillean identity, which got problematized for me when I moved stateside, right? When I was found folks that identified as West Indian, right? And I didn't understand exactly what that meant because it was new to me, right? Other than for us to come from the Spanish Caribbean, right? To think of folks who are not Spanish speaking folk who tend also to present themselves as Black, right? Which is also a problem for me because although my skin color is not dark, this opportunity to also embrace the multiple cultures that make up the Spanish Caribbean countries, right? Part of it is embracing the heritage and presence violently as it was imposed on the cultures of enslaved Africans, right? That came to the Caribbean over 150 years before it ever came to the United States, right? So that's part of how I identify myself. Coming stateside, embracing both the Antillean and Latin American identity also allow me to connect both in ministry and identity with the larger the larger migratory project, right? That make up many peoples in the United States. The one thing that Puerto Ricans do not have, that other Latin American peoples do have, is that Puerto Ricans, by no choice of their own, are born U.S. citizens, right? So I didn't have to go through the whole legal process of identifying myself as other, not a citizen of the United States, but the experience of migration. And I know this is a very complicated statement, even for us Puerto Ricans, and in our relationship with other Latin Americans. I migrated for similar reasons that other people migrate, right? So how do you connect all that and then embrace the fact that I am an American citizen? I feel that I stayed and I embraced staying stateside in a similar experience like Paul, right? Who was born and raised a Jew, but was of Roman citizenship. So what did that mean in his ministry, both with Jews, but also with non-Jews? And that's something that 15 years after ordination, 20 years after being stateside, I continue to grapple with, right? You know, I am neither nor, but I am also both and it's really complicated, and I embrace that complicated that it is.
Yeah, and I love it that both of you complexified everything about your identities in such really beautiful ways, because I think that that's it's a challenge for the Latine community to talk about these things, because we are so complex and rich and diverse in our heritage, and to do that in a way that's actively thoughtful and anti-racist and meaningful about the histories that we carry that are both painful but also really rich and joyous is just, I think, really meaningful. So thanks to both of you for that. And I'm going to just do a short, equally complex introduction for myself. So for me, for those of the folks at Westminster who've known me longer, they'll notice that my last name Flores might not be familiar to them, because that's my family's last name. It's not the one that's on my legal card right now, but I am in the process of changing that, precisely because my identity has been filtered through the lens of what did my legal cards say about who I was. And because of the fact that my father's last name was Kendig, which is sort of like British something, I often got read as white in a lot of my contexts, including because of my skin color, of course. And so I identify as white adjacent. And so I don't identify as just white, because that erases all of the cultural and ethnic and historical pieces that are a part of my identity that I think are important for both political reasons and for reasons of just understanding ethnicity and the complexity of it in this country. That being said, I completely own the white privilege parts of what I need to pay attention to as I kind of move in the world. So that's why anti-racism work is so important to me in particular. That being said, my ethnic identity is my dad was part Lebanese through his mom's side of the family, and he was part British and general white through my grandfather's side of the family. And then my other side of the family is Mexican, and we happen to be Presbyterian Mexican. So that's a product of primarily white missionaries in around the 50s and 20s, 30s, things like that in Mexico. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about that heritage, but there have been some really powerful aspects of it for my family. So two of my aunts and uncles attended the Pan American School in the southern southwest United States. And we are a very particular breed of Latine or Latinx that doesn't always get a lot of airtime. And so I always find it really interesting when you see conversations about Latinos in CNN or the New York Times or anything else, because I often don't see myself reflected there completely. That being said, my mom is a first or a 1.5 generation immigrant. And so she came when she was about 7 years old to this country. So the issues that are happening on the border are very personal to our family, because when she was 7, she didn't know about legality and illegality. She just trusted her parents. So I carry some of those stories in me. And also I was raised in Minnesota. So that's an interesting experience to this as well. So all of that being said, I think one place that might be interesting for us to start, because it really doesn't get reflected in the national news articles about this topic, is the experience of being Latine. And just to say quickly, please bring in any way you want to talk about those words, Latine, or the other word that's very common is Latinx or Latinx, is depending on how you say it. Other times people will say Latino or Latina. People will use the word Hispanic. So if you have anything you want to say about those words, please feel free to go there. But experience of having this heritage and these experiences in the context of the church or the PCUSA, because that's what we can particularly speak to here, given these stories that we bring of coming from islands with a very particular political expression and experience, as you were referencing, Amaury. And Amy Kim, you were talking about your family's experience of not just adoption, but also Manal School and all these other sorts of pieces. So where would we want to talk about the piece of being in the church as Latina people?
So I was baptized a Roman Catholic when I was, a kid. And my mother's side of the family is still Roman Catholic. I grew up, responded to my call to ministry, and actually got ordained in the Baptist tradition. And it wasn't until I came stateside to pursue theological education that I realized that although the Iglesias Bautistas de Puerto Rico, the Baptist churches of Puerto Rico, were a region of the American Baptist Churches USA, right? Being a Puerto Rican Baptist was very different from being an ABC USA, although we shared that connection. A lot of that, of course, it has to do with the history of colonization of the United States. The church came alongside that. I am now an ordained Presbyterian minister, and the somewhat funny thing is that I cannot remember knowing Presbyterians when I was back home. Although there is as long a history of Presbyterianism in Puerto Rico, as long as there has been a Baptist tradition, but Puerto Rico was divided among the missional agencies that came alongside the U.S. military when Puerto Rico was invaded in 1898. So where I lived and with the people that I grew up with, I wouldn't have had the need or opportunity to meet Presbyterians. The curious thing is that part of the reason why I'm a Presbyterian now is because of the Reformed tradition's insistence on connectionalism, which when a lot of people think Baptist and Congregationalist forms of government and the local church being a full expression of the church, as Baptists would describe it, in Puerto Rico, the way I understood church being was that although a local church is a full expression of the church and is a church in and of itself, the ability for us to do mission and witness together is stronger when we band together, right? So interdependence, that was the way that I learned that word, was significant in the way I grew up understanding my own call, right? But it wasn't until a Presbyterian minister of Cuban descent, who was a pastor in Puerto Rico, keep on tying all those things up, came to me and asked me, Amaury, do you feel called to pastor a church, or do you feel called to be a pastor of the church when it clicked, right? The call is never only to a community. The call is to witness to and alongside, right, the community of Jesus, right, which has these many multiple expressions, right? So I have the Catholic background. I grew up at a Baptist. I studied at a Presbyterian seminary, not unbeknownst to me, but I really didn't understand what that meant, right, until I was, reading Karl Barth, and Karl Barth, yay, the kind of thing. And that's part of my background. Something that I continue to grapple with is the history of colonization that led me to the knowledge of Jesus Christ the way I met the guy, right? I cannot think of myself of anything else but a follower of Jesus, right? But how that message came to my homeland, right? And even before the U.S. invasion during Catholic times, right, is problematic. The way I started grappling that within myself, and being honest, I am called to serve a man whose message has been not only politicized, but become a tool of empire, right? And I need to embrace that that disconnect or that complexity, right, of my call. Happened when I was in college and I wrote my thesis for my degree, and I analyzed during the first 5 years of military government over Puerto Rico, the U.S. military's policy of the use of cemeteries, right? Where during the Spanish colonial time, cemeteries were controlled by the church, right? The U.S. Tradition is that cemeteries are often either private or controlled by the civil government, and that got complicated in Puerto Rico because during those first few years of U.S. military presence, Catholics wouldn't allow the burial of Protestants in their cemeteries, although they were city or they were public cemeteries, right? So why did that complexity start? How the civil government and the church used that to divide people in their quest for justice for their own institutional benefits, right? And it took a long time for people to realize, wait a minute, we are being pegged up against each other, right? Not simply because of burial, but because they want to keep power. And what does that mean, right? Has been a part of the way that I have both embraced and continue to grapple with, right? I am the servant of an imperialist tradition, but I am a servant of a tradition that had introduced me to a message, the message of a man that transformed my perspective of the pursuit of justice and inclusion and equity and what a better world should look like.
And I'm supposed to go after that. We're just going to keep doing this little tennis game of ours. This is fan-freaking-tastic. Thanks, Amaury. I told you about my grandfather, right? And that's always been this story that, is held up in our family about his education and how important that was to him. And I unfortunately was awakened far too late. He had passed when I was little. I have so many questions, right? I have so many questions about how he got there in the first place. At what cost did that have for him and his family? At what disconnect from his own culture did that create? What kind of assimilation did he then have to be a part of in order to feel worthy of that education? I think there's a lot of disconnect, right? And I think that so much of what our histories have been romanticized is that kind of like, it was oppressive, but they liked it. They were happy, right? And I'm sure there was happiness in his life. I'm sure there were things that he felt blessed by. But again, I also think there is something about supremacy that lulls us into believing that this is what we wanted all along, because we didn't realize what we were giving up. And so I think that the sacrifice that BIPOC folks have given in order to be accepted into a community that's supposed to be about justice is always something that is troubling and that I continue to kind of need to reflect on. But also, I think it's also why I'm still here in the Presbyterian Church. I grew up not seeing people that look like me in ministry. I did not see a whole lot of women, let alone women of color. I remember the first time hearing Joan Salmon Campbell preach and just being like, who is this person and how do I at least even share any part of her? And then when I was younger, I was asked to be on this National Presbyterian Youth Ministry Committee. And all I knew is that it was going to take me out of Utah at least twice a year to be able to go and see other people. And I was able to be in conversation and in fellowship with folks that really affirmed gifts in me that I wasn't getting affirmed for in Salt Lake City, Utah, in a homogeneous area. And I was able to hear preaching and teaching from a perspective that I had not heard. I remember at 16 understanding more about liberation theology because of a connection with J. Herbert Nelson, who's now our stated clerk. I think that there are places in our church that this the juxtaposition of what justice and Jesus really mean, and how it fights against the empire and the ways the empire has really run rampant in our church and in the government of our church, and trying to figure out how to reconcile those things in those places. I don't think we're there. I think we're still striving. But I also think that I know that the community of folks that I have been able to connect to and call my family has fundamentally changed my life and the trajectory of my family. And so it is one of those things that, while I know that I still have places to heal about the ways that the church has been complicated, and not even just for myself, but other folks, and recognizing that even as someone who at times has felt oppressed, there's always someone who I need to pay attention to that has a different story or a deeper story than I do, and that I may have been a willing participant in part of that oppression, and figuring out how we as a church can continue to grapple with that. I think I always wonder how many people were like me, that I would go and look at like the presbytery stats, and be like, oh, look, I'm one of 5, right? Like, I'm one of 5 in this report, right? And what does that look like? And how has that changed or not, right? Like, just figuring out what is it as a church that we are missing, that folks don't feel connected to this part and this idea of what it means to be a more whole church. And I say a more whole church because I don't think that this is what church was supposed to be, right? Like, it was supposed to be about community gathering and helping one another and making sure there was no one left behind. That is not what church has turned into in so many ways. And so I think as someone who comes with all the identities that I come with, I am both frustrated and thankful for the experience that I've had. But I do, folks like Anna and folks like Amaury, I mean, we have these threads that, we all get on during General Assembly, during different times. And what I love is we're all as passionately in love and in not so much love with the church, and trying to figure out how we continue on, right? And I think it's one of those, like, as long as you show up, I'll show up. And as long as everyone keeps, someone shows up, even if one person wants to quit one day, that's okay, as long as everybody doesn't want to quit that day. I think that is something as a whole church, folks need to pay attention to, right? That I do think that BIPOC folks are a gift to the church. And I'm not saying that in like a benevolent way. I'm saying that their participation and their current level of wanting to be engaged is a gift, and that will not last. Let me just repeat, that will not last if things continue how they have continued. Folks are on the edge, and I don't know what that means, but I'm just saying it is a gift, and I'm thankful to be a part of them. But there will be a time, if we do not continue to really challenge the ideas and the ways we participate in supremacy, that will change.
Yeah. You all just spoke 2 whole entire words. I mean, that was yes to all of that. Yes to everything you were saying, Amaury, as well, about just all the layers of complexity that we bring, but also, Amy, Kim, just to underline what you just said, that there's a graciousness to the way that folks of color, especially folks of color, BIPOC or BIPOC folks who have an anti-racist analysis, who have an analysis of systems, including colonialization, including this word that you threw out, empire, right? Empire is not like the empire in Star Wars, right? Empire is what is spoken about and against in the Gospels. And yet we continue to replicate that today in our church spaces, and we don't realize it, or we don't want to pay attention to it, or it benefits us. And so that mission of how do we be gospel together? How do we be gospel community together gets diluted and even gets betrayed sometimes. And you both spoke to that so beautifully. Yeah, and I echo so many of those threads. Like, I know that I have stories in my family of, the attendance at Pan American School was really important. And it was actually in some ways liberating for some family members who wanted to kind of try something different and all those sorts of things. And on the other hand, we have stories in our family of the fact that speaking Spanish was forbidden. And it was also forbidden in public schools in the United States. So it wasn't just that experience, right? It was many levels of some of those experiences and getting punished for speaking Spanish, right? So my family speaks very good English because in some ways they were forced to. And what does that mean? And how does that affect me as someone who then comes from a blended ethnic and racial marriage where my dad didn't speak Spanish? And so even between my sister and I, we have different experiences of how we sound and how we relate to the Spanish language because of how much we got as very young kids, from my mom and so on and so forth. So just all of those complexities of dynamics, even something as basic as language, and how that also mediates the experience of Latinidad, being Latine or Latinx, and how that is also used as a boundary and a barrier within the Latine and Latinx community, among many other things, because there's internalized racism in the community, and there's internalized pain, and there's internalized colonization. And so there's all these conversations that are happening internal to the world of Latina people that is almost just as complex as the wider conversations we need to be having, because this sort of a mentality of empire, to borrow the language we've been using, or mentality of colonization has infected all of us. And so how do we kind of move through the process of clearing out the energies and the air and the space so that we can truly have a more healthy experience of the gospel that we want to live together as communities?
And how do we forge new space, right? Like, I
Yes.
think that so much of the work that I've done with you all has to do with finding the space we want to be in instead of entering the space that they gave us in the church, because I think that the idea of caucusing in our Presbyterian church in so many ways has started to do far more damage than good. I think in the beginning, it was a tool to try to help people find community among folks like them, whatever that means. But as you can see, all three of us wouldn't all fit in the same box if we tried. There's just no way. And so then you're forced to choose which one do you identify with the most. And in some ways that feels like then you've got to check anything else that has anything to do with anything but that caucus at the door. And if you are going to go to the Hispanic caucus and you don't speak Spanish, well, then you're going to have to be on that side of the room. And if you speak Spanish, you've got to be on this side of the room. And then on that side of the room, you got to decide what kind of Spanish you're speaking as well. I mean, there's all these complexities that I think until you're living in that complexity, you don't quite understand. And then there's also this place of like, but at least we get to be together. So we start feeling like we're really thankful, right, for this space that we were given, like it was a gift. What I think we're starting to realize, or that we're trying to push forward, we're trying to help the church realize, is there isn't a pretty place to put that, right? There isn't a decently in an order place to put all of this. And so what we're recognizing is we're sitting at an intersection and we all need to figure out how we're going to cross back and forth. That you're not going to cross and stay in one place. You're going to be over there for a minute, then you're going to be over here for a minute. And then we're going to figure out how we don't all knock each other out, but how we continue to make those crossroads together. And that means that we have to all learn about everybody. You're not just learning about yourself or the 3 folks of color that are in your congregation, right? That there's a need for us to understand the history. I have been so thankful for my Puerto Rican siblings, for them to help educate me about what it meant to grow up in Puerto Rico, what it meant for them as Presbyterians to try to figure out how they found a place, how they found grounding, and then the whole idea of citizenship. And I mean, all the mess that's been going on the last 4 years around Puerto Rico that has just simply highlighted what's been going on all along, right? And so to have places where I can have those conversations and go, I don't know enough. I need you to tell me some more, and tell me raw. It doesn't have to be pretty, because it's not pretty. And for us to be able in the church to have these not pretty conversations, I think is part of a culture that we are trying to establish, that in order for us to start talking about the ways that Latine folks are operating in the church, we have to be able to tell the stories that are hurtful and harmful so that we can start. And it's not about reparations. I think it's about repair. And I think that there's this part of repair that we forget. It's not about you giving me something. It's about you recognizing the wholeness of me and the ways that the church has been a part of the way the empire has torn me down, has displaced me, has caused me to feel less than in the name of Jesus, right? That connection to faith, or has held power over me in the name of Jesus, and then told me again that I like it and that this is what I want and that I should be grateful for the fact that people are even giving me this opportunity. So I do pray that the church realizes the piece of repair that we all need to be in, that has to do with education and listening. But that also doesn't mean silence. People also are starting to equate listening with silence. Hear me say, friends, silence is not listening. That's just what it is. I'll stop talking. I want to hear from Amaury.
No, there were two things that came to mind as I continue to hear at both of you. One, even on this call, part of the complexity that institutionally the church, but even in our personal relationships, we have to grapple with is the difference of generational experiences, right? With our identity and how that identity got shifted, whether intentionally or not, whether forcefully or not, right? And I think that goes to Amy's comment that left to the way any one of us identify oneself, we wouldn't have met. There were other circumstances that allowed us to meet, right? So that's one part of that, or together with that, is that a call to the institution, local churches, and the broader church to engage with that complexity is not simply asking, oh, you're the Spanish person in my congregation, please come and sing in Spanish, right? Because they may know not Spanish. And the reason they don't know Spanish is because it was beaten out of them, right? Or the reason they know Spanish is because some other more profound language was beaten out of them, right? So there's all of that that has to be considered. And two, that you may be doing something in Spanish, right? And that doesn't mean that it's speaking to the language of the hearts of the people that you're trying to reach out to, right? So the whole invitation to sit down and listen, and I absolutely want to reiterate what Amy said. Listening does not mean silence. There has to be some feeding back, right? Because folks will literally and figuratively be speaking multiple languages, right? The most profound challenge I think the church has is that when we talk about diversity, one of the categories we reduce the issue of diversity is language, and we do not realize that experience is also a language, right? The lens through which people read their own experience and the experience of the people they share a commonality with, right? And whether people embrace that history or not is part of that, right? I'm hearing about Amy's the grandparents. I'm thinking of my own grandfather, who, when in Puerto Rico grew up a nationalist, right? As a part of a very active pro-independence group, but enlisted to served in the U.S. Army on World War II, and died being a pro-statehood person, right? And that might seem strange if you only leave it at that. But when you sat down with my grandfather and talked about that, the reason Abuelo became supportive of the pro-statehood party back when he did that was because he was convinced that it would only be under statehood that labor equality and racial equality and economic equality would happen to Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, right? So he wasn't pro-statehood because he wanted to be white adjacent necessarily, the way we define often that, right? He wasn't even pro-statehood because he wasn't necessarily responding to the American dream, right? Of owning property, whatever, right? He wanted to pursue justice, and he thought that the quicker way of doing that was becoming a state. And I think, he never said this, but I think that pursuit of justice and equality for Puerto Ricans, economic, racial, labor, etc., came from his nationalist background, right? So it is the complexity of who we are in a very plural, diverse R, that our life, it revolves around, right? And one of the things that I think the three of us might agree with is that although the three of us have deep awareness, right, of the racist, disenfranchising, colonial / imperial history of the church that we serve and the country that we live in, and feel called to serve, right? A lot of our people decide not to engage in that discernment and awareness because it hurts, right? Because it hurts. Because it hurts two things, I think, primarily. One, it will hurt seeing, because they know, seeing everything that was taken from us, right, that we would like to embrace again. But it will also hurt, and I think you see this in every migrant group who identifies with a mainline tradition. It would also hurt to realize that the church that taught me, again, what I said at the beginning, to love Jesus, right, probably did it for other reasons than Jesus itself, right? So even this deciding not to engage in that examination of the intersectionalities of our being part of an imperial church, right, or a church that serves empire, right, also goes to that deep awareness that we cannot escape, that comes from the story of the ancestors, that is living in the lives of our elders, right, and that we are all of a sudden realizing now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that so I just want to say, for context, like, for those who are listening and feel like they're drinking from a fire hose of, trying to understand the dynamics of Puerto Rican history and trying to remember, like, okay, what do I know about Manal School? What do I know about the Pan American School? All of these different pieces of history and the context of the church and its cooperation with colonization or with political takeovers of countries and continents. If you're feeling overwhelmed, like, take notes and Google because there's a lot here. And what you're getting is a little bit of unvarnished, or not as varnished anyway, like, we're still being diplomatic here, but a little bit of the richness of the conversations that we have amongst each other and that we need to have with the church, that we are hungry to have with the wider church. And so just underlining all those aspects of the reticence that I experienced from a lot of very wonderful, well-meaning white church folk in particular, who want to do the right thing, but who don't know how to engage with the discomfort, and who want to talk about racism, but don't want to talk about the church and racism. And so, yeah, there's a lot there to talk about. So we joked at the beginning that how are we, give us 55 minutes and we need 4 days because there's a lot to talk about. And the prophecy has come true. So we had a lot of things we were thinking of talking about, and we got to one topic. But I thought in our last couple minutes, I wondered if we could think a little bit about just the fact of recognizing that the conversations that we're talking about inside the church are also being avoided outside the church. So if we bring up the fact of the recent 2020 election and the Latino vote, right? Well, who is that? The Latino vote and who got more of them. And the conversations about Black Lives Matter and whether Latinos, I'm using the language that's most often used in mainstream culture, Latinos support or don't support the Black Lives Matter movement and why they do or don't. Any comments about that related to how that conversation gets parsed when it's read through a white lens versus what you'd want to say about it?
In the Caribbean, we say es complicado. It's complicated. Why not? So let me say around BLM. One of the things that I have been heartened and really deeply encouraged about is that some years before BLM coalesced the way we know it now. In many Latin American countries, there had begun a movement. It's really over a decade old in many Latin American countries. There have been some significant move, whether state-sponsored or local organizing. There are many ways this conversations began about discovering and or re-engaging with the African ethos of the Latin American identity, right? As in to say, you cannot be Latin American anywhere in the continent, right? And not have to grapple with, in one way or another, with the presence of people of African descent that were forcibly brought, right? Mostly if not exclusively for slave labor, right? A good 500 years ago, right? Perhaps to me, the big news of that was a few years ago, Mexico, the country, beginning to count in their census people of African descent. They had never done this institutionally, right? They had never done this institutionally, right? And the fact is that the port of Veracruz was one of the major ports of entry of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And the history we were taught was that in Veracruz, the only thing that happened was a simple exchange of cargo, right? From one ship to another, that mostly then went to Louisiana or to the southeastern coast of the United States, right? When in fact, right? I mean, you go there, right? And the presence of people of African descent in the Caribbean coast on the Gulf Coast of Mexico is evident, right? But there was an institutional push to forget that many years ago. Couple that with the institutional history in Mexico with indigenous peoples, and it gets really complicated, right? But it's all part of our Latin American reaction to what do we need to do politically to become as adjacent as possible to the political and economic powers of the world, right? And again, we don't have time to explore that, but beginning to tie that in. When BLM began to coalesce the way we know it now in the United States, that provided for many in Latin America to be able to immediately respond in support of and solidarity with the movement in the United States. And there are significant conversations throughout the continent now. What does that mean, right? Not simply say, what does BLM, how do we move BLM organizing to other Latin American countries, but these things are also happening in my country. Let's at least be solidarious with each other. The one other thing that I'll say about, especially among Puerto Ricans, especially those who are from the island, but I think this is true about diasporic Puerto Ricans as well, is that as part of that rediscovery in Puerto Rico, that again you cannot avoid, the physical evidence, right, of the African presence in Puerto Rico, is that in Puerto Rico there's a phrase that is being coined now to talk about people who are, quote, evidently Black, personas evidentemente negras, right? That has provided a space for some of us whose skin might not be as dark as some would have it be to self-identify as Black, to understand that in cultural heritage, but also in political construction, we are also Black. You might not be evidently Black, but that doesn't mean you're not Black, right? So one of the things that I'm really looking forward with BLM in the United States, with Pan-Antillian and Pan-Caribbean relations, is what is going to begin to mean for folks from the Spanish Caribbean, which tend stereotypically to look more like me, right? To begin engaging in a more deeper project of embracing negritude, Blackness, right? As part of who we are, not who those special Puerto Ricans are, but who we all are, right? And I'm also wondering how that's going to continue to encourage, and there's evidence of that, of some significant Latine participation in BLM movements.
Yeah. Thanks, Amaury. I think that unfortunately, the tools that the empire has used to divide us, we continue to perpetuate because we want to have categories that we feel like we belong in, whatever belonging means. And so that is when I'm so thankful for young people who have said, well, forget that. That's not what we're about. We are going to move forward and recognize, like Amaury said, the evidence of Blackness in all of us and what that means for us to unite around a cause that does affect all of us. I do think that generationally, again, there are so many complications with how folks are able to ingest, if you will, BLM and what that means. And I also think, again, the tools of the empire have tried to make folks like us believe that it's not for us. And so that's unfortunate. And so being able to speak to that in ways that are life-giving is really necessary and needed. The thing that I find amazing is that this election made people want to be Latine and Indigenous adjacent all of a sudden. That there was this push, and even, you know, we saw the reports of CNN not actually recognizing Indigenous folks for the power that they were having and the things that were going on in Nevada, and the ways that that our siblings pushed back and held the media accountable for what it meant to see people and not erase people or not even recognize people. I think that we have to pay attention to the ways, I always think when you said that, Anna, about the election and thoughts, I said, it was like we were panning for gold and there was gold everywhere and people just finally turned on the glasses and were like, there's gold everywhere, right? Folks are everywhere that are Latine, Indigenous, that are Black and brown bodies who are engaged, who want to be deeply a part of investing in a country that has both harmed them and held them up in different ways. And so I think it has been imperative that people start seeing. Folks, I think what will be interesting is there's something about our siblings of color that you don't mess. If you make promises, if you want to use our bodies and our brains and our hearts to help get you elected, then you also need to recognize that those bodies, those brains, and those hearts are going to keep you accountable moving forward. That it wasn't just a conversation to get you elected, but an ongoing push towards what it means to really be a part of that community and be held accountable in ways that only if you've had a grandmother or mother or father come at you and just look at you and say, excuse me, you know, like, did you not hear me? Did I stutter? That there is a bit of a reckoning that I think will also be a part of the dynamic moving forward because of what happened in the election and because of the ways brown and Black bodies showed up.
I think that's right on. And I think that there's so much to say about the fact that people showed up. And it's important to note that people showed up on both sides or all sides of the political spectrum. So we need to have, like in the Latine community, there are internal conversations that need to be had about, say, the Cuban vote in Florida and how hard there are some folks who have a certain experience of immigration, oftentimes highly marked by privilege, of economic privilege, among other things, including some degree of political privilege, have been mobilized by conservative forces that I don't, politically, it's not about whether I agree with you or not. It's about whether you're interested in justice for more than just yourself, right? And so my concern is that there are folks in the Latine community who are thinking there are some folks who are thinking very narrowly about justice and equity and things like that. And then there are folks who want to have these broad conversations that are cross-disciplinary, cross-conversational, that are cross-pollinating, and that really allow us to be the complex individuals that we are, who have not just a racial identity, not just an ethnic identity, not just a political identity, but a sexual identity or a sexual orientation an experience of living in a certain part of the country, as an experience of living in a certain economic category, being documented or undocumented. All of those things matter. And so I get offended when I see people talking about the Latino vote and, on one side or the other, making it a monolith, because I have a lot of questions for my colleagues who are in the Latina community, who we need to have some serious conversations. And so the final word we'll just add here is that we've been using words like BIPOC and Latine and Latinx and Latinx, things like that. Those are words that you all can look up and Google on your own, but just to say Latine and Latinx or Latinx are words that are gender neutral sort of concoctions by different folks, both in the United States and in Latin America, to try to get at the fact that the word Latino is actually a gendered word, even though you will speak to some Latina people who don't even agree with that, right? So it's not a word that is super, super common. You won't be reading it in mainstream articles, especially written in English, but they do exist. And these are words that are being utilized by folks who are interested in intersectional justice, in talking about racial justice, but also justice for people who are non-binary and other forms of invisibilized identities. So thanks to the folks and the conversations and the space that we had today. Part 2 through 200 coming soon.
Anna, thank you so much. Amy and Amaury, thank you so much for all of your perspectives and what you've contributed to this beginning of many conversations. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to more discussions. Our next social justice forum that we're working on is still in development, but we're working on immigration and refugee affairs concerns. And so stay tuned for more information on that. Thank you all.
Thank you.